Today, I'm going to tell you about D-Day. The Normandy landings were the landing operations on Tuesday, June 6, 1944, of the Allied invasion of Normandy in Operation Overlord during World War II. Codenamed Operation Neptune and often referred to as D-Day. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history. After the German army invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin began pressing his new allies for the creation of a second front in Western Europe. In late May 1942, the Soviet Union and the United States made a joint announcement that a full understanding was reached with regard to the urgent task of creating a second front in Europe in 1942. However, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill persuaded U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt to postpone the promised invasion as, even with U.S. help, the Allies did not have adequate forces for such an activity. The date of D-Day and the World War II Allied landings in Normandy was on June 6, 1944. D-Day in World War II began at 6:30 a.m. on June 6th. Over 1.5 million American troops, together with U.S. airplanes, arms, and equipment, were sent to England in preparation for the invasion of Normandy and D-Day. Alarmed by the raids on Saint-Nazaire and Dieppe in 1942, Hitler had ordered the construction of fortifications all along the Atlantic coast, from Spain to Norway, to protect against an expected Allied invasion. He envisioned 15,000 emplacements manned by 300,000 troops, but shortages, particularly of concrete and manpower, meant that most of the strong points were never built, as it was expected to be the site of the invasion. The Pas de Calais was heavily defended. In the Normandy area, the best fortifications were concentrated at the port facilities at Cherbourg and Saint-Malo. The invasion planners determined a set of conditions involving the phase of the moon, the tides, and the time of day that would be satisfactory on only a few days in each month. A full moon was desirable, as it would provide illumination for aircraft pilots and have the highest tides. The Allies wanted to schedule the landings for shortly before dawn, midway between low and high tide. With the tide coming in, this would improve the visibility of obstacles on the beach, while minimizing the amount of time the men would be exposed in the open. Eisenhower had tentatively selected June 5 as the date for the assaults. However, June 4, conditions were unsuitable for a landing. High winds and heavy seas made it impossible to launch landing craft, and low clouds would prevent aircraft from finding their targets. Group Captain James Stagg of the Royal Air Force, known as RAF, met Eisenhower on the evening of June 4. He and his meteorological team predicted that the weather would improve enough for the invasion to proceed on June 6. The next available dates with the required tidal condition, but without the desirable full moon, would be 2 weeks later, from June 18th to June 20th. Although June 6th is often called D-Day, D-Day is also a generic military term that stands for the day, D, of any major attack. The overall military operation was called Operation Overlord. The actual landings at Normandy were called Operation Neptune. Nazi Germany had at its disposal 50 divisions in France and the Low Countries, with another 18 stationed in Denmark and Norway. 15 divisions were in the process of formation in Germany. Combat losses throughout the war, particularly on the Eastern Front, meant that the Germans no longer had a pool of able young men from which to draw. German soldiers were now on average 6 years older than their Allied counterparts. Many in the Normandy area were Ostalginen, Eastern Legion, conscripts and volunteers from Russia, Mongolia, and other areas of the Soviet Union. They were provided mainly with unreliable captured equipment and lacked motorized transport. Many German units were under strength. The supreme commander of the Allied forces was Dwight D. Eisenhower of the United States. Other Allied generals included Omar Bradley from the United States, as well as Bernard Montgomery and Trafford Mallory from Britain. The Germans were led by Erwin Rommel and Gerd von Rundstedt. Some of the landing craft had been modified to provide close support fire and self-propelled amphibious duplex drive tanks, DD tanks, specially designed for the Normandy landings, were to land shortly before the infantry to provide covering fire. However, few arrived in advance of the infantry, and many sank before reaching the shore, especially at Omaha. On Sword, 21 of 25 DD tanks of the first wave were successful in getting safely ashore to provide cover for the infantry, who began disembarking at 7:30. The beach was heavily mined and peppered with obstacles, making the work of the beach clearing teams difficult and dangerous in the windy conditions. The tide came in more quickly than expected, so maneuvering the armor was difficult. The beach quickly became congested. Brigadier Simon Fraser, 15th Lord Lovat, and his 1st Special Service Brigade arrived in the second wave, piped ashore by Private Bill Millen, Lovat's personal piper. Members of Number 4 Commando moved through Wistram to attack from the rear a German gun battery on the shore. The Normandy landings were the largest seaborne invasion in history, with nearly 5,000 landing and assault craft, 289 escort vessels, and 277 minesweepers participating. Nearly 160,000 troops crossed the English Channel on D-Day, with 875,000 men disembarking by the end of June. Allied casualties on the first day were at least 10,000, with 4,414 confirmed dead. The Germans lost 1,000 men at Omaha Beach. Parts of the Mulberry harbor are still visible, and a few of the beach obstacles remain. A memorial to the U.S. National Guard sits at the location of a former German strongpoint. Point du Hoc is little changed from 1944, with the terrain covered with bomb craters and most of the concrete bunkers still in place. The Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial is nearby in Colville-sur-Mer. A museum about the Utah landings is located at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, and there is one dedicated to the activities of the U.S. Airmen at Saint-Mire-Église. Two German military cemeteries are located nearby. Pegasus Bridge, a target of the British 6th Airborne, was the site of some of the earliest action of the Normandy landings. The bridge was replaced in 1994 by one similar in appearance, and the original is now housed on the grounds of a nearby museum complex. Sections of Mulberry Harbor B still sit in the sea at Aromanches, and the well-preserved Lungs-sur-Mer Battery is nearby. The Juno Beach Center opened in 2003, was funded by the Canadian federal and provincial governments, France, and Canadian veterans. Now please do a moment of silence to pay respect for the brave people who died during D-Day. Thank you for watching this episode of Adventurous Kids. Hurrah!